At the beginning of the 20th century, the United States of America had a new movement called Progressivism. The basic idea was that all of the fruits of industrial production should be available to ordinary working people. How do you do this? Well, have a focus on mechanized agriculture and workers' rights and loose money, the availability of credit to be able to buy mechanized equipment for the farms. This led to the creation of the Federal Reserve, a strong progressive idea. And basically, generals, all of the things that had been known to the world would become available to everybody. Now, they were often accused of being communist. In fact, some people favored communism. But the movement itself developed momentum when the Republican president, Theodore Roosevelt, adopted many of the same basic ideas. It's a uniquely American experience because in most of the developed world, communism or socialism was much more acceptable, and you had a give and a take between the two. The alternative at the time was basically what we would call imperialism. The idea was that a nation needed control of key resources in order to fuel the industrial engine. And that meant, well, control of the world, control of at least bits and pieces of it that would keep everything running. Progressivism or socialism versus imperialism. Which is going to win out? Well, industrial output, the mechanization of the world, turned into great horrors in World Wars I and II. Mechanized slaughter became the order of the day. And in order to prevent that and indeed realize some of the goals of the progressive movement, a system was set up, the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, where instead of controlling resources, a nation would buy them. There would be free commerce around the world. And this would allow some level of local control. Nations could develop on their own basis with the resources that they had. It was an interesting way out of the dilemma between the two. And it's been working. We haven't had a whole-scale mechanized war ever since then. And, well, the world has been lifted out of poverty. But the language remains. On the one hand, we have the language of the left, which it talks about systems that bring resources to people. And on the other hand, we have the language of the right, which is largely about national interest, about nations controlling their own destiny as a nation and the power of a nation. The language of the two has only driven further and further apart. And this is particularly interesting to me because in the United States in particular, it has resulted in decades of talking past each other, inability to get anything done whatsoever. Now, my contention is that we're developing a politics all around the world, which is basically globalism versus nativism. Do you favor a broader global system like the one developed at Bretton Woods, or do you favor a more local control based on local culture, local systems, and indeed that old national sovereignty, the strength of nations? It's a system that we see dividing all the time. But we still have the language of the old industrial system, and we have trouble describing it. To me, that is the main reason why we've gotten so little done, particularly in the United States, but really in the developed world in general. It's been very difficult. Now, in the developing world, you're starting from here and you want to get to this point. The way forward is a little better known. We have the model of the Asian tigers, the model that was first put out by Japan, but also successfully implemented by South Korea and Taiwan, and is being implemented by Malaysia. China is on the way. Ireland as well, the Celtic tiger. There are many countries that are developing along the same sort of system, sort of one step at a time. I like to equate it to the wheel of Dharma in Buddhism. You can't just jump from one end to the other, which is what the Bolsheviks tried to do in the Soviet Union. You have to kind of go through stages of development. And because everything is well known, Work tends to bring people together, even if you have different ideas about who gets the benefit, the people or the nation state. uh, there's something to go around for everybody, and it's not a problem. And we see this in other nations too. For example, in Germany, we've had conservative governments fairly consistently for a long time, and yet they favor strong environmental policies. Why is that? Well, Germany has very few sources of energy itself. It buys a tremendous amount from Russia in particular. Therefore, it is in the national interest to develop native energy sources. What are those? Well, they've kind of run out of coal in the Ruhr Valley, so wind, solar, biogas, all of those things. It's in the national interest. It's also environmentally good. And that's really what my point is. If we continue to use the language of the past, the various isms as I've derided, we're not really going to get anywhere in terms of describing the world that we have to create. Now, after this whole crisis, the concept of globalism is going to evolve, possibly be put down for a while. We're going to be taking care of business. That's not necessarily a bad thing. My contention is that in a world based on technology, that it's really all about the skill of the workers, the working people, and their ability to do things. That the workers are the greatest resource of any nation. Their skills, their ambition, and everything else. You develop those, you develop the nation. That's really what the tiger model is all about, is taking people from one step to another, developing those skills gradually because they do take time. It takes often generations. You can accelerate it dramatically, like South Korea was a very good example, but how to do that. And that's what I want to talk about next in terms of how we create genuine progress around the world for everybody, for you and for me. Because the visions of the early 20th century in the United States were not wrong, it's just that the situation has evolved considerably. How do we change the dynamic of how we talk about things? Now, I'm doing my best here. For example, I had a long video on healthcare where I didn't talk about it at all in terms of the way a normal Democrat like myself might. Yes, we need to take care of people. Yes, it's really obvious. But why should we consider having a centralized healthcare system of some kind? Well, because healthcare as we know it is just not subject to market forces. There are so many market failures all along the system that if we do have market forces, they have to be created somehow. Or we simply ignore that and go right to the top. The other way of looking at it is, why should employers have the tab for healthcare in the first place? Does this really make sense? What is the overhead per employee? What does it cost to have jobs? I mean, the overhead of a 40 to 100% of salary is absolutely incredible. So how do we move forward with that? You see, many of the things that are important in this world can be talked about using the language of the left or the language of the right. One group favors them over the other, and so you tend to hear one set of language depending on where you're going. It is very much in our national interest to develop the talent of people. They are our greatest resource. Is that socialist? Well, it depends whether or not you do things from a top down or a bottom up. And there is a time and a place for both. Generally speaking, the economy comes from the bottom. And we have had so many different top down models. Throughout the pandemic crisis, of course, we have a lot of top down issues. And this is a lot of our politics now, whether or not you are queasy about too much on the top versus things on the bottom. That is a language that we're using, and sometimes it can be a very useful language. But the way forward is often best described by using both sets of language and appealing to both groups. The great divide that has made it impossible for the United States to get anything done, and to a lesser extent, most developed nations find it difficult as language divides us. Really, we can bridge this by using the same language or using the different pieces to describe what it is we want to do. The things that are really good, I believe, can be described in both sets of terms, or for that matter, many sets of terms. And there is a genuine sense of progress. Technology itself is not positive or negative. I mean, as we saw with industrialization itself, it can revolutionize agriculture and feed the world and lift millions out of poverty. But it can also create the horrors of war that we saw in World Wars I and II. Technology can create tremendous efficiency, which throws people out of work. Indeed, this subject is extremely well known. Kurt Vonnegut's first novel, Player Piano, 1953, 2 years before Steve Jobs was even born, dealt with this very issue. What do you do with people to give them employment and to have that basic social contract that you work and you make a living and you get something for it? How do we move forward with that? There isn't really a conflict between left and right in many of the key places to go. A developing nation typically knows this. There's just too much work to be done. And the left and the right can move together on certain key things. In the developed world, we have, well, it's a first world problem. We want to argue about whether the model should be top down or bottom up. There is a time and a place for both, although generally speaking, the economy starts at the bottom. And that's the issue that we've seen. When we talk about things like the velocity of money declining, about just generally income distribution not working, about why debt is so crippling, it comes down to the simple fact that people at the very bottom have a tremendously high overhead, are scrambling from one paycheck to the next, not able to make the long-term plans that are necessary to develop skills and to realize whatever it is that they are good at that brings them great happiness in life. I mean, after all, that's really what it comes down to. The three great things: what you're good at, what you enjoy doing, and what the market values. If you can find an intersection of all three of those, it's fabulous. But it takes time and playing around. We have to think in the long term, and we have to use the language of both. I want to talk about what genuine progress looks like as we come out of the pandemic situation and probably have to create some kind of new world at some point. What is that world going to look like? First of all, we have to describe it. Using the old-fashioned language hasn't been doing us any good for a long time. Let's start over. Let's talk about what we want to do using the language of left and right and everybody else. Describe why it might be a good idea. Thank you.